I've been driving 18-wheelers for 23 years, and I thought I'd seen everything this country had to offer from behind a windshield. The endless ribbons of asphalt, the way headlights cut through fog like knives through silk, the peculiar loneliness that settles into your bones when you're the only soul awake for 100 miles in any direction. But that winter evening in the Wyoming backcountry, something found me out there in all that emptiness, something that shouldn't exist according to every rational thought I'd ever held. I tell you this now because I've carried it alone for too long, this weight pressing against my chest like a hand in the dark, and because what happened out there didn't just change what I believe about the world. It changed what I believe about myself, about the invisible threads that connect us to things we can't name, about the way the universe sometimes reaches down and grabs you by the throat when you're standing at the edge of your own destruction. I was a man coming apart at the seams that day, my marriage dissolving like salt in water, my daughter's voice a memory I could barely recall without flinching. The road had become my escape and my prison, mile after mile of running from conversations I didn't know how to have. The light was dying when I entered that stretch of backcountry, the sun bleeding out across the horizon in shades of copper and ash. Snow covered everything in a blanket so pristine it hurt to look at, the kind of landscape that makes you feel like the last human being alive, or perhaps the first. My headlights carved shallow trenches through the gathering dusk, illuminating the skeletal fingers of bare trees reaching toward a sky going purple and deep. The heater rattled and wheezed, fighting against the cold that seeped through every seal and gap in the cab, and my hands gripped the steering wheel with the mechanical precision of someone who'd forgotten why he was going anywhere at all. I hadn't spoken to another person in 14 hours, hadn't heard my own voice, except for the occasional curse when another driver cut too close, or the road curved unexpectedly. The isolation out there isn't just physical, you understand. It's something that gets inside you, fills up the empty spaces where connection used to live. I was thinking about Sarah, about the way she'd stopped answering my calls, about the divorce papers, sitting in my glove compartment like a loaded gun. The cab smelled like stale coffee and the ghost of 1,000 truck stop meals, and somewhere in my chest, something vital was quietly breaking apart, the way ice cracks beneath weight it can no longer bear. That's when the road ahead of me erupted with movement, a massive shape crossing from the tree line on my right to the steep embankment on my left. My foot slammed the brake pedal before my mind could even process what my eyes were seeing. The trailer jackknifing slightly as the whole rig shuddered and screamed against momentum. In that frozen moment, backlit by my own headlights reflecting off the snow, I saw something that defied every law of nature I'd ever learned. It was huge, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, moving with a strange, purposeful gait that was neither animal nor human, but something else entirely, something older. Its form was pale against the darkening wilderness, covered in what looked like frost-white fur that seemed to absorb and reflect the light. Simultaneously, and for just an instant before it vanished into the shadows, it turned its head toward me. I swear on everything I've ever loved, it looked directly at me through the windshield, and in that gaze was a recognition that sent electricity down my spine, a knowing that reached across the space between us like a hand extended in greeting or warning. Then it was gone, swallowed by the forest as if it had never existed, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the tick-tick-tick of my hazard lights in the sudden, crushing silence. I sat there trembling, hands still locked on the wheel, staring at the empty stretch of road where something impossible had just crossed. My path. The dash camera's red recording light blinked steadily in the corner of my vision, its mechanical eye capturing what my mind was already trying to dismiss as exhaustion, as stress, as anything other than what it actually was. But I knew, even then, sitting in that cab with my heart hammering against my ribs and my breath fogging the cold air, that everything had just changed. This wasn't a hallucination born of too many hours without sleep or the weight of a life falling apart. This was real in a way that transcended explanation. Real in the way that dreams are real when you're still inside them and haven't yet learned to doubt. The wilderness pressed against my windows like something alive and watching, and somewhere deep in those ancient trees I understood that something had seen me, truly seen me, in a moment when I'd never felt more invisible. I shifted the truck back into gear with shaking hands, but I didn't drive away, not immediately, because I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just been given a message in a language I didn't yet know how to read, a summons to something I couldn't yet name, but desperately needed to understand. I pulled over at the next truck stop, 17 miles down the highway, my entire body still vibrating with adrenaline and something else, something that felt like the moment before lightning strikes when the air becomes charged with impossible potential. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of other rigs sitting dark and silent like sleeping giants, their drivers lost in whatever dreams men have when they're this far from home and everything familiar. I climbed down from the cab on legs that didn't quite feel like mine anymore, the cold hitting my face like a physical blow, and I stood there for a moment just breathing, watching my breath become ghosts in the sodium lights overhead. The dash camera system was easy enough to access through the laptop I kept mounted beside my logbook, and my fingers fumbled with the connection cables, trembling not from cold, but from a desperate need to confirm that what I'd seen wasn't madness, wasn't the final unraveling of a mind pushed too far by loneliness and failure. The screen glowed to life, casting blue light across my face in the darkness of the cab, and I scrolled backward through the footage with my heart in my throat, counting the minutes, watching the road unspool in reverse until I reached the moment. There, I hit pause and felt the world contract around me. The image was grainy, distorted slightly by the angle and the gathering darkness, but it was there, undeniable and terrifying in its clarity. The creature filled the frame for perhaps 3 seconds, emerging from the right side of the screen with a motion that seemed almost liquid despite its massive size, its body moving with a coordination that spoke of intelligence and purpose rather than animal instinct. I could see details now that my panicked mind had missed in the actual encounter, the way its fur rippled in patterns that suggested musculature beneath, powerful and ancient, built for survival in conditions that would kill lesser beings. Its limbs were longer than any bear's, more proportionate to a human's, but scaled to something that belonged to a different era entirely. Something that should have died out with the ice ages or existed only in the fever dreams of people lost in blizzards. But what stopped my breath and made my hands go still on the keyboard was the moment when it turned its head toward the camera, toward me, and I could see the profile of its face in the reflected headlights. This wasn't the blunt, simple structure of an animal's skull. There was something else there. A complexity in the angle of its features that suggested awareness, cognition, perhaps even emotion. The eye that caught the light for just a fraction of a second held a depth that made my chest tighten, a knowing that reached through the digital recording and grabbed hold of something fundamental inside me. I watched as it completed its crossing, its gait neither hurried nor cautious but measured, deliberate, as if it had every right to be there, and knew I was the intruder in its ancient domain. I replayed the footage 17 times that night, sitting in my darkened cab while the truck stop hummed with the distant sound of idling engines and the occasional slam of doors as other drivers came and went like ghosts in the periphery of my obsession. Each viewing revealed something new, some detail I'd missed before. The way its breath created clouds of condensation that seemed to glow in my headlights, the subtle tracks it left in the snow that suggested weight and substance, the almost ceremonial quality of its movement across that desolate stretch of frozen road. This wasn't a creature fleeing from human presence or startled by the intrusion of my truck into its territory. It had crossed deliberately, had turned to look at me with intention, as if the encounter itself was the point, as if it had been waiting specifically for me to come down that particular road at that particular moment. The thought should have terrified me, and part of me was terrified, but there was something else too. A strange sense of recognition that I couldn't name or explain, as if some forgotten part of my soul remembered this thing from a time before memory began. I thought about all the miles I'd driven, all the empty landscapes I'd crossed without seeing them, treating the world like nothing more than obstacles between loading docks and delivery points, and I wondered what else I'd missed, what other impossibilities existed just beyond the margins of my deliberately narrowed vision. The footage played again, that massive pale form moving through my headlights, and I felt something crack open inside my chest, some sealed chamber where I'd locked away every question about meaning and mystery and the possibility that the universe was stranger and more alive than I'd allowed myself to believe. When I finally closed the laptop as dawn was breaking pale and cold across the eastern sky, I understood with absolute certainty that this wasn't something I could walk away from or explain away or file under the category of things best forgotten. The creature's image was burned into my mind now, more vivid than memories of my daughter's face or my wife's voice, more real than the steering wheel under my hands or the road stretching endlessly ahead. I'd seen something that shouldn't exist according to every rational framework I'd constructed to make sense of the world, and instead of destroying that framework, the encounter had revealed it for what it was, a cage I'd built to protect myself from wonder, from mystery, from the terrifying possibility that I was part of something larger and stranger than my small, controlled understanding could contain. The dash camera's red light blinked steadily, already recording the new day, and I knew with the conviction of someone who just received a message in a dream that this wasn't over, that the creature had shown itself to me for a reason, that somewhere out there in those frozen mountains, something ancient and knowing had marked me, had seen through the shell of who I pretended to be, and recognized something I'd almost forgotten existed, the part of me still capable of awe, still capable of transformation, still capable of answering when the impossible called my name. I spent the next 3 days nominally completing my delivery route through Idaho and Montana, but my mind never left that stretch of frozen Wyoming highway, never. Stopped replaying those 3 seconds of footage that had somehow become more important than anything else in my carefully compartmentalized life. The manifest I was supposed to be following became meaningless paperwork, the loading docks and dispatch calls just noise in the background of an obsession that was growing roots deep in my chest, spreading through me like something alive and demanding attention I could no longer withhold. I found myself pulling up the footage at every stop, in parking lots and rest areas, the laptop balanced on my steering wheel while other drivers walked past my windows, without knowing they were passing a man, watching something that defied every law of nature he'd been taught to accept. The creature's movements had a rhythm I was beginning to understand, not the mechanical gait of something purely physical, but a cadence that suggested thought behind each step, intention woven into motion like a language I was only starting to recognize as language at all. I became fixated on the moment when it turned its head toward my truck, studying the angle and duration, convinced now that this wasn't a casual glance, but a deliberate acknowledgement, a communication that bypassed words entirely and spoke directly to something primal in my nervous system. The footage quality was frustratingly limited, compressed pixels and night vision grain that obscured as much as it revealed, but I found myself zooming into sections, enhancing the contrast, searching for details that might explain what I was seeing or at least confirm I wasn't manufacturing meaning from digital artifacts and desperate hope. In one frame, magnified until the image dissolved into abstract patterns, I could almost make out what looked like markings in the creature's fur, darker patches that formed shapes too regular to be random, too organic to be man-made, as if the wilderness itself had written something on this being's body in a script older than human alphabets. The tracks it left in the snow had depth and definition that proved this was no trick of light or atmospheric phenomenon, each impression showing the articulation of what might have been toes or claws, weight distribution that suggested bipedal locomotion refined over countless generations, adaptation to an environment that would kill exposed human flesh in minutes, yet seemed to be this creature's natural domain. I researched obsessively, during my legally mandated rest periods, falling down rabbit holes of cryptozoology forums and indigenous legend databases, reading accounts from trappers and hunters and isolated homesteaders who claim to have seen similar things, their testimonies dismissed by mainstream science but resonating with my own experience in ways that made my hands shake as I scrolled through page after page of sightings and theories and desperate attempts to categorize the uncategorizable. What disturbed me most wasn't the creature's existence itself, but the growing certainty that our encounter hadn't been random, that it had chosen that particular moment and location with the same deliberation a person might choose when and where to deliver an important message. I began mapping my route obsessively, studying topographical charts and weather patterns, trying to understand why that specific mile of highway at that specific hour had been the crossing point. And the more I studied, the more I became convinced the creature had been waiting, had somehow known I would be coming down that road, carrying the weight of my disintegrating life, like a visible burden it could read from miles away. The Shoshone woman's words from the diner echoed in my memory with increasing resonance. Her description of the frozen walker as a guardian spirit that appeared to those standing at crossroads, and I found myself wondering if the creature had been drawn not to my physical presence, but to something else, some frequency of desperation or spiritual crisis that broadcast itself across the winter landscape like a signal only ancient things could perceive. My rational mind fought against these thoughts, tried to maintain the skeptical distance I'd cultivated over years of dealing with mechanical failures and logistics problems and situations that demanded practical solutions. But that defense was crumbling with each replay of the footage, each moment spent studying those intelligent eyes reflected in my headlights. By the fourth day, somewhere outside Billings with a load of agricultural equipment I barely remembered picking up, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and insane, the kind of choice that divides a life into before and after with no possibility of return. I was going back to that stretch of highway, back to the exact location where the creature had crossed, and I was going to search for more than just footage and theories and the comfortable distance of a laptop screen between me and the impossible. The truck stop diner squatted on the edge of the highway, like something that had grown organically from the frozen earth rather than been built by human hands, its neon sign flickering against the purple dusk with a rhythm that seemed almost biological, a heartbeat visible from miles away across the empty plains. I'd stopped there without conscious intention, my hands steering while my mind remained locked in that loop of footage and theory and questions that multiplied faster than I could formulate answers. And when I walked through the door into the overheated interior, thick with the smell of old coffee and fryer grease, I felt the attention of the woman at the corner booth land on me like physical weight. She was elderly, her face mapped with lines that suggested decades spent in weather that tested human endurance, and her eyes held something I recognized from my own reflection in the truck's mirror, the particular quality of someone who had seen beyond the ordinary world and been fundamentally altered by the seeing. I ordered coffee I didn't want and found myself drifting toward her table as if pulled by invisible threads, and when she gestured to the seat across from her without surprise or hesitation, I understood on some level that this meeting had been arranged by forces neither of us controlled, that I had been guided here with the same deliberation the creature had shown crossing that road. She spoke before I could attempt small talk or social niceties, her voice carrying the textured quality of wind moving through canyon rock, asking if I'd been traveling the backcountry roads at night, and the specificity of the question made something tighten in my chest, because there was no way she could have known, unless this was part of some larger pattern I was only beginning to perceive. I described what I'd seen with a precision that surprised me. Details I hadn't consciously registered surfacing as I talked, the way the creature's breath had created frost. Clouds that caught the headlights like suspended galaxies, how its movements suggested weight and mass, but also an impossible grace, the sense I'd had of being evaluated by an intelligence that operated on principles completely foreign to human thought processes. She listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, and when I finished, she nodded slowly as if I'd confirmed something she'd suspected but hadn't been certain of until this moment. She called it the Frozen Walker, speaking the name with a reverence usually reserved for sacred things, and explained that her grandmother had told stories of this guardian spirit that wandered the high country in winter, appearing only to those who carried burdens too heavy for their souls to sustain, standing at the precise moment when a person's life could tip toward destruction or healing. The way she described the creature's purpose made my throat constrict because it aligned too perfectly with the timing of my encounter. Those weeks when my marriage had finally shattered beyond repair and my daughter had stopped returning calls, and the isolation of the endless highway had started feeling less like solitude and more like a preview of permanent emptiness. She said the Frozen Walker didn't judge or intervene directly, but served as witness, making itself visible to show that even in the most desolate landscape someone was watching, that the pain we carried mattered to forces older than human civilization, that we were never as alone as the winter darkness made us believe. Her words resonated in my chest like struck metal, each sentence revealing layers of meaning I'd been circling without being able to name. And I found myself describing the dashcam footage with trembling hands, pulling up the laptop from my bag and showing her those 3 seconds that had become my entire world. She watched the replay once, her expression unchanging, but her eyes intensifying in a way that suggested recognition. And when she looked up at me, the sympathy in her face was almost unbearable because it acknowledged what I'd barely admitted to myself, that I'd been hoping for exactly this kind of impossible intervention, some sign from the universe that my life still mattered despite all evidence to the contrary. She didn't tell me what to do with the knowledge she'd shared, didn't offer advice or warnings or instructions, but as I left the diner, I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of the encounter, a reframing that transformed the creature from unknown threat into something closer to guide or herald. The isolation I'd been feeling for months suddenly revealed itself as preparation for this moment, the stripping away of distractions and comforts that had kept me from confronting the essential questions about who I'd become and what remained worth salvaging from the wreckage of my choices. I sat in my truck in the parking lot as snow began falling again, watching the flakes accumulate on the windshield and thinking about my daughter's childhood fascination with stories of monsters that protected lost travelers, tales I'd dismissed as fantasy, without understanding they were her way of trying to reach someone who had already started disappearing long before the divorce papers were filed. The Frozen Walker hadn't been random wildlife or hallucination, or even just an undiscovered species moving through its territory. It had been a message delivered in the only language capable of penetrating the armor of rationalization and emotional numbness I'd built around myself. And I finally understood that dismissing what I'd seen would be the same as dismissing the last chance I might have to change direction before the isolation became permanent and irreversible. The Footage became my obsession in a way that felt both compulsive and devotional, those 3 seconds expanding to consume hours as I replayed them in rest stop parking lots and cheap motel rooms where the heating units rattled like dying breaths and the walls pressed close with their stains mapping previous occupants' private disasters. I could trace every pixel of the creature's form now, the way its massive shoulders suggested musculature designed for purposes beyond human understanding, how its head turned toward my truck with deliberation that eliminated any possibility of coincidence or unconscious wandering. But it was the creature's eyes that haunted me most profoundly during those endless viewings. Even through the grainy dashcam resolution, I could sense something in that brief moment of contact, an intelligence that seemed to look not at me, but through me, cataloguing failures and regrets with the dispassionate thoroughness of an accountant reviewing ledgers of a life poorly spent. I remembered my daughter Emma at 7 years old, curled against me during a rare evening home from the road, telling me with absolute conviction about the monsters that lived in forests and mountains, not to hurt people but to guard them when they wandered too far from safety. Creatures that appeared when someone needed protection they couldn't ask for or didn't know they required. I'd smiled and nodded while checking my phone for dispatch updates, treating her stories as charming nonsense rather than the mythology she was constructing to make sense of a father who was physically present but emotionally absent, already halfway gone to the highway's seduction of perpetual motion without attachment or accountability. The parallel between Emma's childhood tales and the Shoshone woman's description of the frozen walker felt less like coincidence and more like accusation, forcing me to recognize how thoroughly I'd failed to hear what my daughter had been trying to communicate through the only vocabulary available to a child whose parent was slowly vanishing into work and distance and the comfortable numbness of never having to confront his own inadequacy. She'd been telling me for years that she felt lost, that she needed protection, that the monsters in her stories were stand-ins for something, someone. She needed to appear and make everything safe again, and I dismissed it all as imagination while I logged another 100,000 miles and let my marriage decay, and convinced myself that providing financially was the same as being present emotionally. Now, staring at the creature frozen mid-stride on my laptop screen in yet another anonymous room that smelled of industrial cleaner and desperation, I understood that Emma's stories had been, in prophecy as much as plea, her 7-year-old self somehow knowing that her father would eventually need exactly the kind of intervention she'd described, a guardian appearing at the moment of maximum isolation to witness what couldn't be spoken aloud. The frozen walker's appearance felt intimately connected to those bedtime stories I'd barely listened to, as if the universe had taken note of my daughter's mythology and years later manifested it on a desolate Wyoming road specifically for me, delivering the protection she'd once imagined in a form that couldn't be rationalized away or ignored like her childhood needs had been. My phone sat on the nightstand beside the laptop, Emma's contact information glowing accusingly whenever the screen lit with spam calls I didn't answer. And every time I considered reaching out, I felt the weight of accumulated silence crushing my throat closed, months of unreturned messages and missed birthdays, and the final terrible argument when she told me she was tired of having a father who existed only as voice on the phone between long hauls and longer absences. What would I even say now? That I'd seen a monster that made me think of her stories, that I'd driven 800 miles obsessing over dashcam footage because confronting an impossible creature felt easier than confronting the damage I'd done to the only relationship that actually mattered. The motel room walls seemed to contract with each viewing of the footage, the creature's massive form filling my vision until I could barely breathe through the combination of awe and shame, because something that magnificent and terrifying had appeared specifically for me, and I still couldn't find the courage to make the one human connection that might actually heal instead of haunt. I thought about the Shoshone woman's words, that the frozen walker appeared to those standing at life's crossroads, and recognized with sickening clarity that I'd been standing at this intersection for years, paralyzed between the easy path of continued isolation and the terrifying vulnerability of actually trying to repair what I'd broken. And the creature had manifested not to push me in either direction, but simply to make me finally acknowledge I was choosing, that inaction was itself a choice with consequences as permanent as any deliberate decision. The coordinates from my dashcam's GPS led me back to that stretch of Wyoming highway 3 days after the diner conversation. Dawn breaking cold and merciless across landscape that looked less like Earth and more like the surface of some frozen planet where warmth had become geological myth rather than meteorological possibility. I'd driven through the night from Montana, where I'd abandoned my scheduled delivery, calling dispatch with lies about mechanical failure that felt insignificant compared to the larger betrayals I'd normalized over decades of choosing highway over home. And now I stood at the exact point where my truck had nearly jackknifed, breath condensing in clouds that dissipated into air so clear it hurt to breathe. The tracks were immediately visible even to my untrained eye. Massive depressions in snow that had refrozen into ice, each footprint easily 3 times the size of my own boot and spaced with a stride length that suggested something built on a scale that violated comfortable assumptions about what shapes mammalian life could take. I'd brought my phone to photograph them, but found my hands shaking too badly to hold it steady, not from cold, but from the vertiginous sensation of standing at the intersection between rational world and something far older, the tracks offering physical evidence that couldn't be dismissed as stress hallucination or digital artifact or any of the comfortable explanations I'd tried to construct during my obsessive footage analysis. They led away from the road toward mountain wilderness that rose in white-peaked judgment against morning sky, and I understood with certainty that defied logic that I was meant to follow them, that the frozen walker had left this trail specifically for me to discover, an invitation written in compressed snow and shadow that extended beyond mere curiosity into something closer to summons or sacred obligation. My truck sat idling on the shoulder as I gathered supplies with the methodical preparation of someone who'd spent 30 years anticipating mechanical emergencies, but had never once prepared for spiritual crisis or mythological encounter that demanded response beyond roadside repair. I took water bottles that would freeze within hours, energy bars that tasted like sweetened cardboard, the emergency blanket that seemed laughably inadequate against cold that felt less meteorological and more existential, and the printout of Emma's last email that I'd carried in my wallet for 8 months without responding. Her words about needing space and time, and a father who actually showed up, becoming more devastating with each compulsive rereading. The rational part of my brain screamed warnings about hypothermia and getting lost and dying alone in wilderness that had killed more prepared men than me. But rationality felt increasingly irrelevant when confronted with tracks that shouldn't exist, leading toward mountains that seemed to shimmer with significance beyond their geological composition. I thought about calling someone, dispatch, Emma, even Karen, despite our divorce being finalized 3 years ago, but realized I had no language to explain what I was doing that wouldn't sound like breakdown or suicide mission, no way to articulate that following impossible tracks into frozen wilderness felt less like death wish and more like the first honest action I'd taken in decades. So I locked the truck, pocketed the keys with wallet and phone, and stepped into the first massive footprint, my own boot, disappearing into depression that still held the shape of something that had passed this way with purpose. I was only beginning to understand. The tracks led through terrain that grew progressively more difficult as morning advanced toward noon, the initial gentle slope giving way to steep inclines where I had to use my hands to climb, and My breath came in ragged gasps that burned my throat with cold that felt like punishment for every soft year spent sitting in climate-controlled cab, avoiding physical exertion and emotional labor equally. But with each struggling step came memories I'd successfully avoided for years, through the simple expedient of never stopping long enough for reflection to catch up with motion. Emma at 4, throwing a tantrum when I left for another 2-week haul. Her face pressed against the window while Karen held her back, and I pretended not to see either of their tears in my rearview mirror. Emma at 12 during the Christmas I missed entirely because of weather delays I could have anticipated and worked around if I'd wanted to, badly enough. Her voice on the phone, carefully neutral in a way that hurt worse than anger would have, because it meant she'd already started the process of emotional distance that I'd been modeling since her birth. Emma at 16, telling me she'd made honor roll and gotten led in the school play and been accepted to her first-choice college in a single efficient email that read like business correspondence, because that was the relationship I'd tacitly insisted upon through years of trading presents for productivity and confusing financial provision with actual fatherhood. The wilderness swallowed these memories without judgment, pine trees heavy with snow. Standing witness to confessions, I hadn't realized I was speaking aloud until my voice echoed back from frozen valley walls, each word a small exorcism that left me simultaneously lighter and more burdened by the weight of recognition that I'd wasted years that could never be recovered or replayed or redeemed through any amount of belated regret. The sun reached its apex and began its early winter descent as I climbed higher into mountains that seemed less like geological formation and more like architecture, designed specifically for transformation through ordeal. The frozen walkers' tracks, never wavering from their purposeful trajectory toward some destination I couldn't see, but could feel, pulling at something deep in my chest that had atrophied through disuse and deliberate neglect. My phone died somewhere around hour 3, battery surrendered to cold that penetrated layers of inadequate clothing and reminded me that I was catastrophically unprepared for this journey in every way that mattered, both practically and spiritually. A man who'd spent decades avoiding difficult terrain of emotional honesty, now literally climbing mountains in pursuit of creature that represented everything I'd refused to acknowledge about mystery and meaning, and the possibility that the universe operated on principles beyond logistics and efficiency. I should have turned back. Every survival instinct and practical consideration demanded retreat to the truck and warmth and the known world where monsters stayed safely metaphorical. But the tracks continued upward, and some part of me understood that following them was no longer optional, that I'd crossed threshold during that night drive from Montana, or maybe years earlier during one of the 1,000 small moments when I'd chosen road over family and convinced myself the choice didn't matter, because there would always be time later to repair what I was gradually destroying through accumulated absence. The mountains rose around me like witnesses to a trial I was conducting against myself, and with each labored breath I felt something shifting in my chest. Not forgiveness, but perhaps the preliminary acknowledgement that forgiveness might be possible if I could just reach wherever these impossible tracks were leading me before darkness fell or strength failed, or the comfortable numbness I'd cultivated for 30 years reasserted itself and convinced me to descend back into the life I'd been living rather than climb toward whatever terrifying transformation awaited in the altitude and cold and thinning air that made each thought feel crystalline and unavoidable. The valley opened before me near dusk, like a revelation written in snow and shadow, the frozen walkers' tracks leading down into a basin surrounded by peaks that seemed to lean inward with the focused attention of elders gathered around confession, and I understood with sudden clarity that this was the destination toward which I'd been climbing all afternoon, and perhaps all my life, without knowing it. The depression was perfectly circular, impossibly sheltered from wind that had scoured the exposed slopes I'd just descended, and in its center stood a cluster of ancient trees that had somehow survived at this altitude where nothing should grow, their branches heavy with snow that glowed luminescent in failing light. The tracks led directly toward those trees, and then simply stopped, as if the creature had either vanished into air or was waiting somewhere in the shadows between those massive trunks, watching my approach with patience that made human urgency seem childish and insignificant. I stood at the valley's edge, feeling my legs trembling from exhaustion, and something deeper than physical fatigue, every cell in my body screaming that I should retreat while some quieter voice insisted that retreat was no longer possible, that I'd climbed too far and confessed too much to turn back now without completing whatever business the mountains and the creature and my own devastated conscience demanded of me. The air felt different here, charged with significance that had nothing to do with altitude or temperature, and I realized I was crying without having noticed when the tears started. My face wet and freezing, and the salt taste in my mouth mixing with the thin mountain air that burned my lungs with each increasingly difficult breath. Karen's voice echoed in my memory from our last real conversation before the divorce papers, asking me why I always ran toward the next delivery instead of staying to face what I was running from, and I dismissed her question as dramatic overstatement when really it was the most accurate diagnosis anyone had ever offered for the cowardice I'd disguised as work ethic. I descended into the valley with steps that felt ceremonial despite my graceless stumbling, each footfall in the frozen walker's tracks like walking in the footprints of judgment itself, and the memories came faster now, as if the valley was extracting them like payment for passage, or perhaps preparing me for what awaited in those impossibly living trees. Emma at 8, asking me to read her a bedtime story about mountain guardians during one of my rare nights home, and I'd been too tired from the road to do more than scan a few pages before kissing her forehead and escaping to television and beer, never realizing that she'd been trying to share something important about her inner world, and I'd rejected the invitation without even recognizing it as one. Emma at 14, when she stopped asking when I'd be home and started making plans that deliberately excluded any possibility of my participation. Her careful independence, not rebellion, but adaptation to my chronic unavailability, learning to not need me, because needing me had proven repeatedly to be exercise in disappointment. Emma at 19, sending that final email, explaining that she loved me but couldn't keep trying to maintain relationship with someone who was never fully present, even during the rare moments he was physically available, her words so measured and mature that they broke something in me I hadn't even known was still intact. The valley swallowed these memories like an altar accepting sacrifices, and I found myself speaking them aloud again with more detail and honesty than I'd managed on the climb up, my voice cracking as I catalogued failures that I'd spent years minimizing or justifying or simply refusing to examine, because examination would have required change and change would have required courage. I'd convinced myself I didn't need, because the road provided perfect excuse for avoiding every difficult transformation that real intimacy demands. I was sobbing openly now as I walked, my face a frozen mess of tears and snot, and the kind of ugly crying I hadn't allowed myself since childhood, each confession stripping away another layer of the protective numbness, until I felt raw and exposed and more terrified than I'd been at any point during the dangerous climb, because physical danger was simple compared to the existential vertigo of recognizing how completely I'd wasted the most important opportunities of my life. The ancient trees loomed before me as I reached the valley's center, their trunks massive beyond any species I recognized, and their bark marked with patterns that looked almost like writing in some language that predated human alphabets. and between their roots the snow lay undisturbed in drifts that suggested nothing had walked here in decades or centuries. Despite the tracks that had led me to this exact spot, I collapsed against the nearest trunk, my legs finally refusing to support weight they'd carried beyond reasonable endurance, and in my delirium of exhaustion and emotion, I pressed my forehead against bark that felt warm despite the freezing temperature, speaking to the tree, or the mountain, or the frozen walker, or God, or whatever force had orchestrated this impossible pilgrimage. My final, desperate confession. I told the silence about the man I'd meant to be when Emma was born, how I'd held her in the hospital and made promises I'd sincerely believed about being present and engaged and the kind of father I'd never had, and how I'd broken every one of those promises through the accumulated weight of small choices that had seemed insignificant individually, but had collectively constructed the abandonment I'd inflicted while telling myself I was providing. I confessed that I'd known what I was doing even as I did it, that every time I volunteered for the longer haul or extended the delivery window or chose the truck stop over the hotel where I could have called home, I was actively choosing distance over difficulty, that my workaholism wasn't about financial necessity, but about emotional cowardice dressed up as masculine responsibility and provider identity. I admitted that I'd been terrified of Emma from the moment she was born, terrified of the vulnerability she represented and the ways she could hurt me by needing me, or rejecting me, or simply existing as living evidence that I was responsible for something infinitely more important than any freight I'd ever hauled, and that I'd let that fear drive me away from the only relationship that had ever really mattered into the sterile safety of highway miles, where nothing was asked of me, except that I show up on time with the correct cargo intact. The words poured out until I had no more words, until I was just gasping against the tree bark with my eyes closed and my heart hammering irregularly in my chest, emptied of everything except the bottomless ache of recognition that I'd destroyed something irreplaceable, and no amount of belated truth-telling could rebuild what I'd spent decades carefully dismantling. The quality of silence changed, and I opened my eyes to find the frozen walker standing 30 feet away between the trees, its massive form so perfectly still it could have been carved from ice or manifested from the snow itself, and I understood that it had been here the entire time, watching my collapse and confession with the infinite patience of something that existed outside human time and measured significance by different metrics than urgency or productivity. It was even larger than the dashcam footage had suggested, easily 12 feet tall with proportions that were almost human, but stretched and refined into something that transcended human limits, its body covered in white fur, or perhaps scales, that caught the last light with prismatic intensity, and its face, I could only glimpse it partially in the shadows, held features that seemed to shift between animal and human, and something entirely other that my mind couldn't quite process or categorize. We regarded each other across the snow-filled space between the trees, and I felt no fear, despite every rational instinct that should have been screaming danger. Only a profound sense of being seen more completely than I'd ever been seen before. Every failure and fear and feeble hope exposed to scrutiny that felt less like judgment and more like the kind of recognition that makes judgment unnecessary because truth itself provides all the accountability anyone could need. The creature tilted its head slightly in gesture that conveyed acknowledgement, or perhaps permission, and I found myself standing despite exhaustion that should have made standing impossible, my body responding to some unspoken invitation or command that bypassed conscious decision and accessed something deeper than volition. The frozen walker held my gaze for what might have been seconds or hours. Time felt negotiable in that valley where normal rules seemed suspended. And then it turned with grace, impossible for something so massive, and began walking away toward the far tree line, its movement deliberate and unhurried, and I understood with absolute clarity that this was farewell, that the creature had done what it came to do by bearing witness to my breaking, and would now return to whatever realm or dimension or mythological space it inhabited between manifestations, leaving me alone with the wreckage and possibility of whatever came next. I wanted to call out, to ask the creature to wait, or explain or somehow confirm that what I'd experienced was real, and not the hallucination of a man losing his grip on sanity in the high altitude where oxygen deprivation could conjure visions from desperate need. But my voice caught in my throat, as if speech itself would shatter whatever sacred understanding we'd achieved through silence and witness. The frozen walker moved between the ancient trees with footfalls that should have crunched through snow, but made no sound at all, its massive form seeming to phase slightly at the edges, as if it existed only partially in the material world and partially in some adjacent dimension where myth and reality occupied the same space without contradiction. I took an involuntary step forward, my hand reaching out in gesture that was half supplication and half farewell, and the creature paused without turning back, its stillness radiating acknowledgement that felt like forgiveness, though nothing had been spoken and no absolution explicitly granted. In that suspended moment, I understood that the frozen walker wasn't judge or savior, but something more fundamental. A mirror that reflected truth without distortion, a presence that created space where pretense became impossible, and the only choice was between honest reckoning or continued flight into the comfortable lies that had brought me to this threshold of complete dissolution. The weight of that understanding pressed down on my chest with force that made breathing difficult, and I realized I was terrified not of the creature, but of what accepting its reality would mean for every certainty I'd constructed about how the world worked, and what was possible beyond the narrow channels of logic and materialism I'd used to navigate existence without ever really engaging with mystery or wonder, or the possibility that some questions didn't have answers that fit neatly into rational frameworks. The creature began moving again, and I felt panic rising as it approached the tree line where shadows gathered with depth that suggested not simple darkness but actual passage into somewhere fundamentally elsewhere, and I found my voice finally breaking free in a single word that was neither question nor plea, but simply Emma's name, spoken into the frozen air like prayer or confession, or the last desperate attempt to anchor meaning to the encounter that was ending, before I understood what it had really been about. The frozen walker stopped at the boundary, where ancient trees met impenetrable shadow, and for the first time it turned its massive head to look back at me directly, and I saw its face fully in the last rays of dusklight that somehow penetrated the valley despite the surrounding peaks that should have blocked all illumination. What I saw wasn't monstrous or alien, but impossibly ancient and sad, features that held the accumulated sorrow of witnessing countless humans arrive at this same threshold carrying burdens they could barely articulate, and pain they'd spent lifetimes trying to outrun, and in its eyes, dark and depthless and somehow familiar, I saw reflected every moment I'd failed to choose, love over fear, connection over safety, presence over the seductive numbness of perpetual motion that had seemed like living, but had really been the elaborate form of hiding. The recognition that passed between us in that moment felt like being known completely and forgiven anyway, not because my failures didn't matter, but because the creature understood that humans break themselves trying to avoid breaking, and that sometimes the only path to healing runs directly through the destruction we've spent years trying to prevent, and that arriving at this valley and speaking these truths meant I'd finally stopped, running long enough to let consequence catch up with cause and transformation catch up with desperation. Tears froze on my face as I nodded to the creature in acknowledgement that I understood, that I would carry what I'd learned here back down the mountain and into whatever remained of my life, that I wouldn't waste the terrible gift of this encounter by retreating back into the comfortable numbness that had brought me to the edge of losing everything that mattered. And the frozen walker held my gaze for 3 heartbeats that felt like benediction before turning back toward the shadows. Then it was gone, not walking into darkness, but simply absent, as if it had never been there at all, or had only ever been there in the way that dreams are real while you're dreaming them, and mythological truths are real in dimensions that transcend simple material existence. And I was alone in the valley, surrounded by ancient trees and gathering night and the crushing silence of aftermath. I stood frozen in place, afraid that moving would somehow invalidate what had just occurred, or reveal it to be delusion brought on by cold and exhaustion, and the psychological break I'd been courting for years through accumulated avoidance of everything that required genuine vulnerability. But the tracks remained visible in the snow, leading to exactly where I stood, and then disappearing at the tree line, as if the creature had stepped through membrane between worlds that humans could approach but never cross. My body began shaking with cold I'd been too overwhelmed to notice during the encounter, and I understood with sudden clarity that I needed to leave the valley immediately or risk becoming another mystery that rescuers would puzzle. Over in spring, when they found my frozen body preserved in snow like ancient remains that archaeologists study for clues about how people lived and died in times before technology provided illusion of control over forces that were always and forever beyond human mastery. But before I turned to begin the desperate descent in gathering darkness, I knelt and pressed my palm into one of the frozen walker's tracks, feeling snow that held shape impossibly despite hours that should have softened any impression. And I spoke a promise into the frozen silence that I would remember, that I would change, that I would find Emma and tell her I was sorry and ask not for forgiveness I hadn't earned, but simply for chance to begin building trust through consistent presence instead of destroying it through chronic absence dressed up as noble sacrifice. And whether the mountain or the creature or simple physics of speaking intention aloud heard that promise, I felt something shift inside my chest, like ice breaking after long winter, painful and terrifying and absolutely necessary if anything new was ever going to grow. The stars emerged as I stood on trembling legs and turned back toward the valley's edge, where my footprints from the descent still marked the route I'd followed in what felt like another lifetime, though mere hours had passed since I'd stood at the rim, deciding whether courage or madness would determine my next move. And I chose to believe they heard, chose to believe the encounter was real, chose to believe that transformation was possible, even for someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of emotional disappearance, because the alternative was returning to the truck and the road and the empty miles with nothing changed except new knowledge of how completely I'd failed. And that knowledge, without hope of redemption, would have been burden that finally crushed what remained of my will to keep trying. I climbed out of that impossible valley in darkness, broken only by starlight that seemed preternaturally bright, as if the mountains themselves were illuminating my path. Or perhaps I'd simply become more attentive to sources of light I'd spent years ignoring in favor of the hypnotic glow of dashboard instruments and highway signs that marked distance traveled without ever indicating whether the journey meant anything beyond accumulated miles. And each step upward felt like choice to believe in, possibility, rather than surrender to despair that would have been easier and more consistent with the patterns I'd established, but would have made the frozen walker's witness meaningless and my confession worthless, except as catalogue of failures I already knew by heart. When I finally reached the ridge, where I could see my truck waiting far below, like beacon of ordinary reality, I looked back one final time at the valley that was already disappearing into shadow and distance, and I whispered thank you to whatever forces had orchestrated this impossible grace, this collision of myth and desperation that had somehow given me one more chance to become the person I'd failed to be when it would have been easier and less costly, One more opportunity to choose presence over flight, even though every instinct I'd cultivated screamed that vulnerability was danger and emotional exposure was weakness, when really the opposite had always been true, and I'd just been too frightened to acknowledge what everyone who'd ever loved me had tried to teach. Through their increasingly exhausted patience, the descent to the truck took hours that felt like meditation or penance. And by the time I reached the vehicle with its faithful engine still idling and its dashcam still recording nothing but empty road, I was someone different than the man who'd parked there at dawn, not redeemed or healed, but finally willing to begin the much harder work of actual change, instead of the performance of regret that lets men feel bad about their failures without actually modifying the behaviors that create those failures in the first place. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine rumbling its familiar comfort and stared at the dashcam screen that showed nothing but empty highway stretching toward mountains that held secrets I could never prove to anyone who hadn't experienced them firsthand. And I understood with perfect clarity that this was the test, whether I would cling to evidence that might validate my sanity or trust the transformation that required no external confirmation, because it had occurred in territory beyond documentation or rational proof. My finger hovered over the delete button while some desperate part of my mind catalogued all the reasons to preserve the footage. Protection against future doubt. Proof that I hadn't imagined everything. Insurance against the slow erosion of certainty that would inevitably occur. Once I returned to ordinary life, where mysterious creatures didn't exist, and grown men didn't receive spiritual intervention in frozen valleys that might not even appear on maps. But I knew that keeping the footage would be another form of running, another way to avoid the vulnerability of simply believing without proof and trusting that what mattered wasn't whether I could convince others, but whether I would let the encounter actually change the behaviors and choices that had brought me to the edge of losing everything worth preserving. The frozen walker had offered witness, not evidence, transformation, not validation, and reducing that sacred exchange to digital file I could replay obsessively would be betraying the very lesson I'd traveled into mythological territory to learn about presence and faith and the courage required to live without constant reassurance that you're perceiving reality correctly. I pressed delete and watched the footage disappear into digital void, erasing the last material trace of what I'd seen, while the memory burned with clarity that no recording could have captured anyway, because cameras only register surface, and what I'd experienced in that valley was something that occurred beneath or beyond the visible spectrum, where souls recognize truth, even when minds rebel against impossibility. The screen went blank, and I felt simultaneously bereft and liberated, mourning the loss of proof while celebrating the commitment to trust internal knowing over external validation. And I understood this was what faith actually meant, not believing in comfortable certainties, but continuing forward despite having no guarantees except the ones you forge through consistent action, aligned with newly discovered values rather than old protective patterns. I thought of Emma, and how many times I'd demanded she prove her feelings, or justify her anger, or provide evidence that my absence had damaged her, when what she'd needed was simply for me to believe her testimony about her own experience without requiring documentation that met my standards of acceptable proof. And I saw how my insistence on material verification had been another wall I'd built to avoid the terrifying work of genuine emotional presence. The parallel was so obvious it hurt. I'd been asking everyone who loved me to provide evidence sufficient to overcome my resistance, while refusing to extend the same trust I now had to summon for myself regarding an encounter that defied every rational framework, but felt more true than anything I'd experienced in years of careful, documented, provable emptiness that I'd mistaken for responsible adult life. I pulled back onto the highway as dawn broke over the mountains, with light that seemed especially vivid, as if the world had gained additional dimension overnight. Or perhaps I'd simply remembered how to actually see instead of just processing visual information while my attention remained trapped in endless loops of regret and self-justification that prevented genuine engagement with present moment. The truck's familiar vibrations and sounds became almost meditative, rather than numbing, each mile feeling less like distance accumulated and more like intentional movement toward destination that mattered beyond the economic transaction of delivery and payment that had been my entire definition of purpose for longer than I wanted to calculate. I didn't have plan for what I'd say to Emma or any illusion that single conversation would repair damage that had accrued over years of choosing road over family and convenient absence over difficult presence. But I had something more fundamental than plan. I had willingness to be uncomfortable, to sit with her anger without defending myself, to acknowledge harm without immediately pivoting to explanations that would dilute accountability. The frozen walker had shown me that witness was sometimes more powerful than words, that simply being present for someone else's truth without trying to manage or redirect or minimize it was form of love I'd never learned because it required exactly the vulnerability I'd spent lifetime avoiding. But now I understood. That protection I'd thought I was providing through emotional distance had really been protection for myself, disguised as sacrifice for others. The miles disappeared beneath my wheels, and I drove not away from the mountains but toward home, for first time in memory, carrying no evidence except changed heart and no proof except commitment to different choices. And that felt like enough because it had to be enough, since mystery by definition cannot be captured or preserved or reduced to facts that satisfy need for certainty without destroying the very essence that makes transformation possible. I thought of the frozen walker's ancient, sad eyes that had seen countless humans arrive at threshold between who they'd been and who they might still become. And I understood I was joining lineage of people who'd encountered something impossible that had somehow saved them by reflecting truth they couldn't face alone. And whether that creature was myth or material or something that transcended the binary didn't matter, because the change it had catalyzed was absolutely real and would be proven not through footage or testimony, but through sustained different actions that Emma would either recognize as genuine or dismiss as temporary performance. And I had to be willing to accept either outcome while continuing to show up regardless, because that's what actual commitment meant, as opposed to the conditional version I'd been offering, where I'd stay, as long as it wasn't too uncomfortable or demanding or threatening to the carefully constructed identity that had been slowly suffocating everything authentic underneath its protective layers. I arrived at Emma's apartment on a Tuesday afternoon when winter light slanted through bare trees and made everything look both stark and somehow hopeful, and I sat in the truck for 20 minutes trying to organize thoughts that refused organization, because what I needed to say couldn't be rehearsed or packaged into neat explanations that would minimize her justified anger or rush past the years of accumulated absence that had taught her I was reliable only in my unreliability. The dash cam mount on my windshield sat empty now, and I touched it reflexively, remembering the footage that no longer existed and feeling grateful for its absence, because walking up to her door carrying proof of supernatural encounter would have been just another deflection, another way to make the conversation about something extraordinary that had happened to me rather than the ordinary sustained failures that had happened to her. I knocked without plan or script, carrying only willingness to hear whatever she needed to say and resist every impulse to defend or explain or minimize, and when she opened the door, her expression cycled through surprise and suspicion, and something that might have been cautious hope before settling into guarded neutrality that told me exactly how much damage I'd done and how little she trusted that this time would be different from all the other times I'd promised change before returning to familiar patterns that prioritized my comfort over her. A presence We sat across from each other at her small kitchen table, where winter light fell between us like something we both had to cross, and I told her I was sorry without qualifications or pivots to mitigating circumstances. And the words felt inadequate, because of course they were inadequate, since no apology could restore the birthdays I'd missed, or the recitals I'd scheduled routes to avoid, or the thousand small moments when she'd needed father and found only empty chair or distant voice on crackling phone connection, promising next time would be different. She cried, and I let her cry without trying to fix it or make it stop or redirect toward forgiveness that would relieve my discomfort. And I cried too, because finally allowing myself to witness the pain I'd caused without protective barriers of rationalization or defensiveness meant feeling the full weight of what my choices had cost the person I loved most in this world. She told me about the nights she'd waited by the window watching for headlights that never appeared, and the stories she'd invented about where I really was, because the truth that I simply preferred the road to her company was too painful for child's heart to accept. And she told me about the monster stories she'd loved, where lonely people were found and protected by creatures that cared enough to show up, and I understood. She'd been telling me what she needed all along, but I dismissed it as childish fantasy rather than hearing the testimony underneath about abandonment and longing for presence I kept refusing to provide. I didn't tell her about the frozen walker because that story belonged to me and would have functioned as distraction from the story that belonged to her. The one where her father had chosen poorly for years and was now asking not for immediate forgiveness, but for opportunity to demonstrate through sustained action that something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface of promises she'd heard too many times to trust, without extensive proof built from consistency rather than dramatic gestures that would inevitably fade. Instead, I told her I was changing routes to local deliveries that would keep me home most nights, and I told her I understood if she needed time or distance or ongoing evidence before believing this change was real, and I told her I would keep showing up regardless of her response because the work I needed to do wasn't conditional on her absolution, but on my commitment to becoming person who deserved relationship with daughter I'd taken for granted while she was growing up in my absence. She asked why now, after all these years, what had finally changed, and I almost told her about the creature in the valley and the tracks in the snow and the moment of profound witness that had cracked open defenses I'd maintained for decades, but instead I just said I'd seen clearly for first time what I was losing and decided it mattered more than whatever I was protecting by staying away, which was true enough even if it left out the mythological catalyst that had made the seeing possible. We talked until the winter. Light faded, and she made coffee, and we talked some more, not fixing everything because everything couldn't be fixed in a single afternoon, but beginning the slow, difficult work of building connection from rubble of what I'd destroyed through years of benign neglect, disguised as necessary sacrifice. And when I finally left, she hugged me at the door and said, "Come back Thursday for dinner," with instruction that carried both invitation and test, and I drove away, understanding that I would keep coming back for every Thursday, and every other day she'd allow me access because the frozen walker had shown me that witness and presence were forms of love that required showing up without guarantee of outcome or reward, beyond the integrity of actually living according to values you claim to hold. The empty dashcam mount caught streetlight as I merged onto familiar roads that suddenly felt like pathways to something other than escape, and I touched it one final time, acknowledging the footage that would never exist as evidence, while the transformation it had catalyzed continued in realm beyond documentation, and I understood that some encounters leave no trace except changed trajectory and different choices and willingness to believe that mystery sometimes intervenes exactly when we need it most, even if we can never prove it happened to anyone, including eventually ourselves, when Memory fades, and ordinary life reasserts its rational frameworks. But by then, the change has already occurred, and the proof exists, not in recordings but in repaired relationships and sustained presence and courage to keep showing up, especially when it's uncomfortable, because that's where actual love lives, in territory beyond certainty, where we choose connection, despite having no guarantees except the ones we create through actions aligned with who we're becoming, rather than who we've been. Have you ever encountered something that changed everything but left no proof except your transformed life? Subscribe for more stories where the impossible becomes the catalyst for becoming who we were always meant to be.